I realized that basically rooftop solar customers had saved utility ratepayers a bunch of money, billions of dollars, because they had invested in their own rooftop arrays that had met the peak load requirements of the utility system.
How embarrassing is it when a state builds its rooftop solar compensation policy on a massive calculation error? Since 2013, investor-owned utilities have pushed a false narrative about rooftop solar in service of their own profits. 2 years ago, the California Public Utilities Commission bought the lie based on a faulty study by the state's Public Advocate's Office. Joining me in May 2025, regulatory economist Richard McCann, a partner at M-Cubed Consulting, shared the results of his stunning debunk of the faulty analysis and conclusively showed that rooftop solar is a net benefit to all California utility customers. A warning to any state that thinks following in California's footstep on rooftop solar policy will have beneficial results. I'm John Farrell, Director of the Energy Democracy Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and this is Local Energy Rules, a podcast about monopoly power, energy democracy, and how communities can take charge to transform the energy system. Richard, welcome to Local Energy Rules.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
I would love to start by just asking you a little bit about how did you get to be doing this work that you're doing? You published a study about the costs and benefits of rooftop solar in California, and sort of broadly as part of work you do as what you call a regulatory economist. How did you end up doing that kind of work?
Well, I've been in consulting my entire professional career, starting out from my master's program back in 1985. I guess I'm pushing 40 years here at this. And I got involved initially in water issues, but then also in energy planning over time. I actually worked on the study to close Rancho Seco in 1989. So I've done a range of energy studies, also water work in California, environmental studies over time. And I started testifying for intervener stakeholder groups in the mid-90s in California. And I've been doing that kind of work since then. We don't work for electric utilities. My other partner, Steve Moss, and I do a lot of this work together. I have a third partner who works in water policy issues. And I just had been progressing along doing some of this work. In the early 2000s, I prepared the cost of generation report for the California Energy Commission for about a dozen years. And I also testified at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on behalf of the California parties about the market manipulation that was being done by the merchant power generators. And so all of that's kind of built up over time. And this issue came up in 2020 about changing the net energy metering tariffs that the utilities have with rooftop solar customers. And there's about a third of the customers are actually commercial, agricultural, and industrial customers. And one of my clients is a group of agricultural clients, many of them large water districts, but also farming operations. And they have a particular kind of net metering contract where they can aggregate across multiple properties. And so I went in and prepared this analysis. And in preparing that analysis, I went back to work that I have been doing over the previous 30 years of testifying in these electricity cases, and found that basically the utilities have been consistently over forecasting the amount of load growth that was going to occur, and that load growth didn't occur. And I did a chart that showed that in 2005, the Energy Commission had forecasted that the California Independent System Operator peak load was going to rise to over 60,000 megawatts by 2020. But in 2020, the peak load was only about 50,000 megawatts, which was the same as it had been in 2006. And then when I looked at the growth in rooftop solar installed over that same time period, it was about 15,000 megawatts, which happened to be almost exactly the difference in the peak forecast that the CEC had forecasted back 20 years, 15 years before, and what we were seeing today. And as I dug into that more deeply, I realized that basically rooftop solar customers had saved utility ratepayers a bunch of money, billions of dollars, because they had invested in their own rooftop arrays that had met the peak load requirements of the utility system. So the utilities didn't have to spend money on generation, on transmission, or there was some distribution that's probably been displaced as well over that time. And when I started doing those calculations, I found that basically the amount of reduced rates revenue that was coming to the utilities was roughly equal to about the savings that had been created by these customers over that same time period. So essentially, it was a break-even deal. And so that caught the attention of the California Solar and Storage Association about a year later, and they asked, would you dig into this, because this assertion about a cost shift from rooftop solar customers to other ratepayers is becoming a more salient issue in the state, both at the Public Utilities Commission and in the state legislature. And so I dug in and started doing some analysis on that. And that's what I've been doing for about a year now. I had not testified for the rooftop solar industry before that, in other states, but not in California. And so this is something new that I've gotten diverted into working on.
Well, I want to ask kind of a framing question here. So the context in which we usually talk about it now, about this issue of the cost shift, is about rising electric utility rates. So people are saying, oh my gosh, rates are rising so much. California is, you could almost call it at a crisis level with the amount people are charged on a per kilowatt hour basis, although obviously the amount that they pay on their bills is actually maybe still comparable to what is paid in other states, just because people conserve a lot in California and because of the climate there. But what in some of the research that you've done, one of the things I think is most interesting to ask is, what is actually the biggest driver of rising electric utility rates?
Well, that's an interesting question. The one thing that we discovered by looking into this is it's not rooftop solar, and it's not shifting of costs from one set of ratepayers to another set of ratepayers, because it turns out that, and I could talk about this a little more, that the benefits that these customers are delivering is still about the amount of rate revenue that is being saved by the investments they make. So we can move on and set that aside as one of the causes. What's really driving rates right now is rapidly rising distribution rates and rapidly rising transmission rates. But this is not a story that it is something that's happened recently. When you start looking back in history, this is something that's been happening since 2002. In fact, it's California's rapidly rising rates starting around 1990 is what drove us into restructuring in the first place. Utility rates were a crisis in 1996 when we adopted restructuring. And cause of the rising rates then were generation costs, a lot of uncontrolled QF costs, but also very large nuclear power costs from San Onofre and from Diablo Canyon. And so those elements drove up the rates. We had restructuring. Then we had a disaster during restructuring because of some poorly designed market operations and some poor decisions about how to compensate the utilities. So then we came out of that. Our rates went up by 4 cents a kilowatt hour after that. And then we had rising rates again starting from 2002. They stabilized around 2012 for a couple of years, and then they started rising again rapidly. One of the driving factors being that the utilities signed excessively priced renewable power contracts in order to meet their renewable portfolio standard targets, and to do it much more quickly than they should have. So we ended up with excessively priced contracts, and currently the portfolio cost of those contracts are twice what you could go out and buy in the market for renewables if you were able to contract them today. But we're locked out of it. California ratepayers are locked out of that new market because we already have so much renewable power that we've already overcontracted for. So we have that aspect of it. And then starting around 2015, 16, the distribution rates really started to take off again. This is before wildfire. expenses, before the wildfire expenses arrived. Even when we had the big wildfire in 2017, the rates started going up a lot, but the utilities weren't doing a lot to manage wildfire risk yet. That didn't really start to hit rates until 2020 or so, but rates were already going up quite a bit. I looked back at the forecasts of increased load that the utilities were putting into their rate cases, their general rate cases from 2009 to 2018. And I found that PG&E had over forecasted load over that time period by a cumulative 99%. And Edison had over forecasted by 76%. And the PUC had authorized additional transmission spending, or distribution spending, I should say, based on that excessive load forecast. And so I don't have the data to go back and do the auditing. Doing the auditing on that period is going to be a very expensive exercise. Several $1 million for the PUC if they're willing to go back and do that. But to look at the question of how much of that investment was actually used by the utilities in order to deliver power, or do we have a bunch of gold-plated transformers out there that are serving our customers? And this came up, the reason why I started looking at that was because PG&E in the 1990s had overbuilt around Fresno, which is a big farming area, the most productive farming county in the country. And that area is where my clients, agricultural clients, were. And so we went in and said, you're building a bunch of distribution for suburbs that are not going to be built here. And the suburbs were not built. And we got the PUC to force them to not spend any more money on distribution in that area. And so I think that the same thing again was happening 10 years later over that time period. The utilities anticipating this big housing boom, because 2006 they were building lots of houses, and the housing boom, of course, crashed in 2009, and the utilities didn't adjust their forecasts for what changed. So that's one side of it. And then the other side is transmission, where I just recently did an analysis. It's up on my blog site, where I looked at distribution investment from 2011 until 2023. And what I found is that transmission in California costs about 12.5 cents a kilowatt hour to add to the system. And that transmission is built almost entirely to deliver grid scale renewables, or to support the delivery of grid scale renewables. So, for example, they've reinforced the transmission ring around Los Angeles. Well, if they still had the same generation inside the LA basin meeting their loads, the same fossil generation, they would have never had to reinforce the transmission ring around LA. They had to reinforce it because they were importing a bunch of renewables out of the southeast deserts in California to Los Angeles. So that's just one example of how transmission spending has also gone up quite a bit. And PG&E's transmission rate, their retail rate, has gone up 1,000% over the last 20 years. So this is an example of where this spending is probably happening. The thing is it's hard as an intervener with a small consulting firm to absolutely say, yes, that's what's happening. It's going to take an army of analysts to actually track this down and to point to where all of this excessive spending has happened.
Oh my gosh, there's so many things I want to ask you about this. First of all, I think I just want to emphasize, as many listeners of this podcast know, of course, a utility overspending is definitely a problem for customers. It's not a problem for utility shareholders, though, because that's how they make their money, is that making those kinds of capital investments. So I just want to acknowledge here that there is this difference of interests between the investor-owned utility shareholder and the customer that is supposed to be mediated by the Public Utilities Commission. So when you talk about an army of analysts needed to audit this, that's where that army should be employed, or where that work should have happened probably. Isn't that right?
Yes, they have let things slip through, and too often the intervener parties in these proceedings have focused on the trees and ignored the forest. And that's just a very common outcome in all these cases.
I'm going all the way back to your intro for just a second, which to say, I remember those cost of generation reports for the California Public Utilities Commission because I used them in some of my early work at the Institute. So thank you. I had no idea that I had this connection to your work way back then. I found this extremely useful. So I just wanted to mention that really quick before we move on. Let's come back. You already kind of talked about this remarkable alignment between the peak demand forecasts that didn't materialize and the rise of rooftop solar. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how has solar been meeting the peak demand needs? Some people talk about, as we get too much solar, it doesn't necessarily align with when we have peak demand. So my first question is kind of like, is it still working and serving that purpose of avoiding the utility having to make investments? And do you think it can continue to do so? Like, if rooftop solar were to continue to grow, the commission wasn't actively trying to squash it via various mechanisms, could it continue to help mitigate peak demand growth?
So it's a 2 or 3 part question there, and so
I'm famous for these. Sorry, take it, chunk it up.
Well, I just gave a very long answer, so you countered with a very long question. So the first thing is there is a difference between customer peak demand and metered peak demand, and that difference is growing in California. And when you look into the amount of solar that's installed and look at the shape, the profile of what solar output looks like from rooftop systems compared to the metered peak, that is what the utilities actually see on their meters, you see that the load shape is basically the same now as it was 20 years ago. The customer peak is still at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon in California. And so the metered peak has actually shifted 3 hours later. It's now around 6 o'clock. And that's entirely because of the installation of rooftop solar. It was kind of interesting when I did the analysis and found that it had shifted on average over that time. You can just see it in the data. And so what is happening is rooftop solar is currently meeting peak load. It's just not the peak that the utility is seeing. And so it does have value for the peak load. And one of the key elements I realized that indicates how important that is as a peak supply, there's always a complaint, solar's unreliable, it has variable output, it's a big problem. Well, if you look at the variations in the metered peak load during the day, it's not really any different than it was 20 years ago. There's always minute-to-minute variations. People turn on lights, turn off lights, air conditioning comes on, goes off. There is some small increase in that variation, I understand, but it's not directly attributable to variations in solar output. It's that rooftop solar is actually very consistent. It's what we call the portfolio effect, is that if you have 110 kilowatt sized solar arrays, they are going to have a more consistent and reliable output than a single 1,000 kilowatt generator over time, because it's the portfolio effect. It's why we're told to diversify our investments in stocks so that we don't have big swings up and down. And you just see that in the data. In California, what they do is they subtract the rooftop solar output from the load forecast. And so it doesn't show up. The California ISO doesn't see that generation at all. It doesn't show up. They don't put in a reserve margin for it. They operate, their 7% operating reserve margin is based off of the metered load, not off of the customer load. Their reserve margins for planning purposes are based on the reserve on the metered load, not on the customer load. There's benefits of various kinds that roll through this. And so you end up with this big gap between the metered load and the actual customer load. And an additional benefit that comes in is California and the West Coast has a large amount of hydropower, most of it of which can be stored during a day and output at the peak time and then reduced overnight. Well, if you look at it, that peak output from the hydropower has also shifted 3 hours. And so what's happened is solar is actually creating a new peak load resource in the evening by basically shifting several thousand megawatts of hydro output on the West Coast from 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 or 7 o'clock at night. And so that is actually, solar is not only meeting the customer peak load at 3 o'clock, it's creating a situation where more resources are available to meet the metered peak load at 6 or 7 o'clock on top of that.
And I can imagine this is only getting better with battery storage resources now being added to the grid left and right, that you're now adding more capacity in which solar can dump power midday, and that can then be shifted to meet that, as you call it, the metered load, the stuff that the utility is still planning for in the evening.
Right. Yes. Yes. And so one of the things is there's probably, it needs to be more serious analysis of what should the rooftop or distributed solar resources look like going forward, and whether you should have the storage incorporated with the new solar installations, which is what California was trying to do with their new net billing tariff, or NEM 3, that they came up with in 2022. Although they kind of screwed it up when they did it. The prices are way too low and don't actually reflect the true value of solar. So they're not getting as much built as they need to get built going forward of distributed solar resources.
I mean, there's sort of an irony there too, because if, as according to your calculation, the benefits of solar were outweighing the costs, what the commission started from was, how do we sharply reduce compensation for people who are just doing solar, and then maybe adjust that to try to encourage people to do storage? What I hear you saying is, from your study, number one, they shouldn't have been so quick to try to cut compensation for solar producers, because now we're just getting less solar as a result of that, even though it was still of a more benefit than cost. And in addition, it sounds like they also didn't manage to do the transition to encouraging people to do storage very well.
Correct.
Okay. So I want to come back to the transmission and distribution spending, and I really appreciated your kind of broad overview of what's driving utility costs. I think that sort of multi-decade history actually is kind of missing from our current conversation, and I think it helps to maybe unobscure some things that people ought to know more about. So you talked about the costs of nuclear plants back prior to the year 2000. You talked about the costs of restructuring, adding immediately to customer bills, having to clean up the mess that, was the market design and then the manipulation by Enron. You mentioned that there were these premium priced renewable energy contracts. I'd love to dig into that just a little bit more before we get back to the transmission and distribution. So I think what you said, if I understand correctly, is the thing that the utilities could have done differently was maybe not necessarily that they shouldn't have gone out and bought renewables at that price, because they were expensive at that time. And part of the idea of the policy was we drive down the cost by getting some early market adoption. But you're saying they basically bought too much too quickly, and if they had gone maybe more slowly, it wouldn't have turned out as expensive?
Correct. And so what they could have done instead is staged the contracts, kind of layered them in over time, so that they didn't have this rush of new renewables that they had between 2008 and 2012. They bought almost their entire portfolio in that time period. And the other thing that they did is sign contracts for 20 to 30 year periods, which means that basically they locked out the ability to go back out 10 years from now and sign new contracts at half the price, because we got savings in solar generation from learning by doing. We locked ourselves out because of that. And they could have signed 10-year contracts and had those signed in first, and then had 10 years with a provision for renegotiation or something along those lines over that time. So those sorts of things they really blew. And then on top of that, PG&E refused to sell parts of their portfolio to the new community choice aggregators that were emerging, because basically they were trying to kill them. And they got called out on that. There was a state law that was passed that said that they could not campaign against the CCAs, because they were campaigning against Marin Clean Energy, the first CCA. So all of that led to this situation where we've just simply have totally messed up the renewable portfolio costs in the state and locked in all of these excessively high rates on that side of the ledger.
I'm so glad you mentioned the CCAs, because I actually talked to Don Weiss, who's the CEO at Marin Clean Energy, way back in Like, it was one of the early podcast episodes I did about that fight with PG&E just to get these community procurement agencies stood up. And I think David Roberts on Volts actually just had her on recently to talk about kind of how that has developed over many years. So a couple opportunities for folks to go and learn more about that. I want to ask you one other thing about the renewables. So you mentioned specifically, and this gets into our conversation about the transmission and distribution spending, which I think is kind of my core interest here in terms of what's driving utility rates. You mentioned in Los Angeles, they reinforced this kind of transmission ring around Los Angeles to help facilitate the import of renewable energy from large-scale installations like in the deserts to the east. I've worked with, for example, Bill Powers, who is down in San Diego and in Los Angeles. I remember him doing some analysis, maybe not specific to LA. I think it might have been around San Diego, but he was essentially saying it would be cheaper to meet our clean energy needs with rooftop solar, especially on like commercial buildings where you'd build it at a fairly large scale, than it would be to import renewable energy. Is that any part of kind of the analysis that you've done, or do you have any thoughts about whether or not that could have actually been a way to save ratepayers money when they were out doing a lot of procurement at that time?
Oh, sure. Bill's analysis of the Sunrise Power Link, where he found that the cost was around 9 cents a kilowatt hour to build that project at the time. That was what made me think to look harder into the transmission costs. And it took me a little while to figure out how I was going to tease out that cost. And then I realized that I could do it fairly simply by compiling the revenue requirements that were incrementally added by the utilities over a set period of time. And I also realized that the state has not added any fossil generation since around 2012. Nothing of that type is being built in the state, at least not in a large amount. And so if I picked the right time period, I was going to be able to largely attribute the increased transmission costs to the new renewable generation that was being built at the time. And it turned out that the correlation factor, that is it's called R squared, the measure of the variation in revenue increases that could be attributed to the addition of new generation, was about 89%. So it's a very powerful result, even though I only have about 12 years of data. That's not a great number for doing that kind of analysis, but coming up with such a high value indicates that it's probably pretty close to the actual value that you would derive. And an engineer wouldn't do this. An engineer would go out and try to gather all the reports and study all the various links. And I as an economist, I go, no, I just need to know the relationships and not really have to deal with all of the specific pathways in which these costs occur. I can just look at the overall result of what happens. And one of the hidden secrets of electricity planning is that it's not load growth that drives transmission spending. It's load growth that drives addition of generation, and the addition of generation is what drives transmission spending. Because it's basically transmission is largely just getting the power from a generator to a substation. And that just gets people in their mind. It used to be that load growth and generation rose together and transmission spending also rose at the same rate. And so you could say, oh, it looks like load growth drives transmission. Well, now that we're in a situation where there's no load growth and we have massive increases in transmission spending, it becomes revealed that it's actually generation that's causing transmission spending increases, not load growth.
And that just makes it so much more interesting, too, when you talk about it being generation, because, of course, to your example earlier about the difference between customer load and metered load, utilities aren't actually seeing load growth, both because of ongoing strong conservation programs in California, but because customers have installed 15,000 megawatts of rooftop solar, which has kept that peak from growing. So that sort of broke the mold then on doing this correlation between load and transmission. Now it really is very clear that you're building transmission to support large-scale energy generation projects that need transmission. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, I ask Richard about the lax oversight of utility transmission and distribution spending. the evidence that utility profits are excessive, and a step-by-step debunking of the California Public Advocate's study about rooftop solar, with Richard's analysis showing that rooftop solar provides benefits for California solar and non-solar customers alike. You're listening to a Local Energy Rules podcast with regulatory economist Richard McCann, a partner with M-Cubed Consulting. Hey, thanks for listening to Local Energy Rules. We're so glad you're here. If you like what you've heard, please help other folks find us by giving the show a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. 5 stars if you think we've earned it. As a bonus, I'll gladly read your review aloud on the show if it includes an energy-related joke or pun. Now, back to the program. I was debating whether I was going to ask you a question that would make me sound stupid because of my, 2 statistics classes, and I decided I'm going to skip making myself sound stupid and leave it with what I think you had a very good explanation of what happened about that relationship. So, knowing that transmission and distribution investments by utilities are driving a lot of the cost increases for California ratepayers. And as you said, that they're not really associated with wildfire mitigation. We know transmission is associated with new generation, but the distribution stuff seems to have started increasing before that. I mean, you sort of answered this question when you talked about needing an army of auditors to find out how the money was spent for some of these cases. But it seems like the more I read about this, the more I am learning that it seems like there's not really a lot of scrutiny about some of these expenditures. For example, I had Claire Weiner from RMI on the podcast recently to talk about her report on what she called the regulatory gap that suggested that utilities can make actually pretty big investments in transmission without a lot of state or federal oversight. I know you're mostly an economist, but is that kind of your assessment digging into these numbers as well, that there's really not been a lot of scrutiny of how much spending is happening?
No, there isn't. That was one of the reasons why I had put in my testimony starting in 2009 about this discrepancy between what they were forecasting for load growth and what you could see was actually happening on the ground, both with Energy Commission forecasts and their recorded load and how that was building up cumulatively over time. And what I was trying to trigger was a deeper dig into why the utilities were asking for $2 billion in quote unquote load growth spending for distribution in each one of their rate cases when there was no load growth. This was something where the Public Utilities Commission and some of the the Public Advocate's Office that we used to be, it had previous names, like 3 other names before that, weren't digging into this. And some of the key intervener groups were not really pursuing this question either because they got caught looking at the trees. And even there, part of it is the intervener compensation incentive is you need to show you made a difference in a rate case. Much easier to show you made a difference when you say, oh yeah, that power pole replacement program that they have going right now is not cost effective in this particular neighborhood. And you can show it, oh yeah, we made a difference in the decision. And you need to compensate us a couple $100,000 for our effort, rather than if you do go in for they are overinvesting and we show that they're overinvesting by $2 billion and then the commission overrules you, you risk not getting any compensation for the $1 million that you spent to try to prove that case. So you go for the small ball. You don't go for the home run because it's too risky for the financial viability of your organization.
This feeds so well into my next question about Mark Ellis, who's been on my podcast to talk about his focus on utility rate of return. So he's a former Sempra executive. Sempra is like the umbrella company for
SDG&E and SoCal Gas. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And so he left the utility business. And in that role, I should say, he was in the C-suite advising executives on kind of like, where should you put your money? And he was saying essentially like the rate of return you're earning is so great. Stop doing any kind of like speculative investing on side businesses and put all your money into infrastructure because we're earning a huge amount on that. So he really is, to your point about the forest versus the trees or going for the home run, he is interested in telling people to focus more on this issue of utility rate of return, how much they earn for making those infrastructure investments. And in a recent op-ed that he had in the SF Chronicle, he said, investor and utility profits have outstripped inflation by nearly 50% in the past 3 years. But at publicly owned utilities, rates are still going up, but almost 50% slower than inflation. might seem like a really dumb softball question, but do you see evidence to suggest why there's such a substantial difference between the investor-owned utilities and the publicly owned ones?
Well, in the investor-owned utilities earn money on every dollar of capital that's invested. They earn 10% return, almost guaranteed. I testified in that same cost of capital case that Mark testified in on behalf of the Environmental Defense Fund. And we put in a data request. Please list all of the disallowances of investment that you've had over the last 10 years or something like that. And they came back with almost nothing. I can't remember if the number was less than $50 million or it might have been like nothing. And so nobody is telling them, no, you can't spend this money. And they come into these cases knowing that what they ask for is going to get knocked down. So they overbid. It's just they approach it not as a legitimate cost recovery case, but rather as a negotiating process in which they aim high and then they get knocked back to what they actually expected to spend and earn return on. And so I did the analysis. I came up with a similar rate of return that Mark did using a completely different method, where I looked at a combination of matching the market value of the utilities to the book value of the utilities. When I was doing the analysis, the market value was about twice the book value. So essentially, customers are paying for twice the authorized amount of investment because they really pay based on the market value of the utility. And then I looked at the return of the utilities, what they were earning in terms of their price earning ratio compared to the rest of the stock market. And over the 10-year period that I looked at, the utility return on equity was about 3 or 4 percentage points higher than it should have been based on doing that kind of analysis. And what was interesting is there was another academic study that came out in 2019 that basically came to the same answer using a different method. And then more recently, another study that came out of the UC Energy Institute by 2 students there that they also came up with 7%. So it was kind of like, yeah, there's all of these answers that are saying the standard business school way of doing this analysis using capital asset pricing models is giving an answer that's way too high.
It's probably too technical for our crowd, but suffice to say that if you're making 10% return right now and all the evidence suggests you should be making 7%, that's lots of dollars, lots of millions of dollars that customers are overpaying for electricity based on how much utilities are earning.
Yes.
I want to come back to your specific analysis that you did with CalSSA about the impact of millions of customer-owned solar arrays in California. Can you just give a brief summary of what was the top line? Is customer-owned solar good for customers?
Yes, we found in doing our analysis that it looks like those customers are delivering an actual benefit of about $1.5 billion a year. The Public Advocate's Office had claimed that it was $8 billion of net costs and cost shifts. So we basically showed there was a swing of about $9.5 billion in terms of the actual benefits accruing from these customers.
Can you walk through that? The thing I really appreciated about your study, and it was covered in Canary Media as well, and I'll have a link to that news article where they gave this summary of your study. But could you there were, I think, 5 main things that basically the Public Advocate's Office got wrong in their analysis of rooftop solar costs and benefits. Can you just walk through that? Because I think it's really important for people to understand that you can have someone, in theory, in this business, they are intervening in cases all the time and still make really big mistakes about how to calculate the value and the costs from rooftop solar.
And I'll just add that we've actually done some further analysis since then that shows that the benefits are even bigger than what we published. That was done in January. So, for example, the transmission cost data that I used had a lower value in that analysis than what I actually derived recently. So the first problem that they had was they used a capacity factor for the solar units that was too high. They said 20%. Everybody else says it's 17 to 18%. That was $1 billion difference right there. They calculated the avoided retail rates without taking into full account the fact that most solar customers are on time of use rates. So they had overestimated that. That was close to another $1 billion. And then they ignored the fact that 15% of rooftop solar customers are actually on the low income subsidy program CARE, and that would knock it down several $100 million more in terms of the savings. So all of those errors, and other people have indicated that we're right on these issues, is about $2.5 billion. Just right there, right off the top. So now we're down to $6 billion roughly in terms of what's remaining. The next one is that they implicitly asserted that the utilities own the right to charge customers the full retail rate for electricity that is generated off their rooftop and consumed by the customer directly from the rooftop. So the utility is providing no services whatsoever to the customer, yet they are under obligation in this view to pay the utility for the full retail rate. And it's about 50% of the output of rooftop solar is consumed directly by the customer. It doesn't get past the meter. And so that knocks down the estimate by another $4 billion.
I want to just dwell on this for a second because it only in the like energy wonkosphere is this even considered controversial. And even then it's like just a few people who I think are quacks. But utility is saying, you customer have spent thousands of dollars on a solar array to produce electricity for your own use. The electricity that comes off those panels and immediately runs into your house and powers your fridge and your washing machine and your phone charger. You're supposed to pay us for that. And that's $4 billion of what we're counting against you in this analysis of rooftop solar.
Right. And sort of an interesting analogy is the difference between a battery EV and a plug-in hybrid. And because I have a plug-in hybrid, using this analogy, every time I fill up my plug-in with gas, I should be paying PG&E for the electricity that I'm not using because I'm using gas instead.
All right, we're down $6 billion out of the $8 billion from the Public Advocate's Office.
Yeah, wow. Right. So the next one is they used the current avoided cost calculator to calculate the value of the electricity. The thing is the avoided cost calculator is only forward looking, and it only uses very short-term avoided costs in order to value solar. So it ignores the capacity value of solar. It uses a investment in transmission and distribution as though it's only next year. You're only avoiding next year's investment, not investment 20 years down the road. And that number was around 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, if you do the analysis I did, which was go back and look at what was actually avoided, look at the combustion turbines that weren't built, the transmission lines that were not built, the distribution lines that were not built, it turns out that there's about $2 billion of additional benefits that they ignored in their calculation. And that takes us down to zero. So now we're at zero. That the benefits and the costs are weighing off against each other. Then further, those CARE customers that we were talking about, well, other customers don't have to pay the CARE subsidy. So they're actually saving not having to transfer money to those customers. That's about another $150 million. It's not a big number, but it's an example of how something that they overlooked. But then the other big thing that they really overlooked was that these customers are still paying the utility for power that they buy beyond what their solar array produces. And we asked for data requests to the utilities. Well, how much are they paying? Well, it turns out they're paying over $100 a month on average in terms of bills. Well, the average bill is somewhere around $200 a month. So these customers are contributing. Their bill is about 50% of the average bill for all other customers. And the utilities claim that their fixed costs are about $50 a month. Well, if you do a little bit more math, it turns out that these customers are contributing on average about $70 a month to the fixed costs. So they're ignoring that it's another $1.5 billion of contribution to fixed costs. And when you add all of that up, you go, well, actually, these customers are contributing $1.5 billion or more to reducing the revenue requirements for the utilities. What's the question here? What's going on? So because so many people, there's certain people who've been saying there's a cost shift for so long, they can't bring themselves to admit that this analysis is actually correct. And so they try to say things like, well, you're connected to the grid, and so you have to pay for the grid. And I go, well, we are. We're paying $70 a month for something you say costs $50 a month. So therefore, you need to set that aside. We're paying for the grid and the connections and those fixed costs. What is it that you're actually trying to assert is that we're not paying for?
Right. I find this fascinating on two levels. One is I also have solar panels on my house here in Minnesota, and I pay more per month than I did before I put them up at this point, 6 years ago, because I have two plug-in cars and a heat pump. And I imagine a lot of other solar customers in California are similarly saying, hey, now that I produce my own electricity, I want to use it for other things. And so I'm going to invest in things. You have a plug-in hybrid vehicle, for example, that use electricity. So I just think it's funny that we have this notion somehow that because I'm finding some way to produce my own electricity, that I'm no longer part of the grid system or contributing to the grid system, when at least my personal experience is Xcel Energy is doing just fine. They're getting plenty of my money even after I did that solar investment. I guess the second thing, though, is, to your point about people having this cost shift language in their head for so long is, I can't think of the exact term of the aphorism, but it's basically like never count on someone who's understanding something whose paycheck, demands that they do not understand it, right?
Yes.
Like,
yeah, never admit the truth when it's inconvenient to you.
yeah, and we know for a fact that utilities more than a decade ago, that the Edison Electric Institute, the trade organization of investor-owned utilities, warned utilities that this was going to affect shareholders, that customers doing rooftop solar would save money. I mean, just as an example, that $2 billion of benefits that you talked about in not built infrastructure, transmission lines, et cetera, that was saved because solar was built, that is $200 million at their 10% rate of return in return to utility shareholders that was missed because rooftop solar customers made that investment instead. So it's very clear to me, and I hope increasingly clear to other people, that utilities have strongly, strongly motivated arguments in this conversation because of the fact that their profits depend on building things instead of rooftop solar customers.
Yeah, and I actually used that motivation on behalf of a client about 10 years ago. I have a set of clients who own mobile home parks for the state association, and they have private utility systems that were built back in the 50s and 60s because of the way the rules existed for utilities. They didn't want to build them, but they were forced to. And they have been trying to transfer those systems to the utilities. And I finally pointed out to the utilities that if they bought the systems and invested in them and rolled them into rate base, they were going to make more money. And it was like a light went off in their head, and they had been opposing this strategy for about 10 years. Then the light went off and went, oh yeah, now we're all in. And they just went gangbusters for this program. So it's just, understanding their motivation is sometimes key to figuring out how to get them to change their behavior.
Well, Richard, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you so much for your detailed analysis of the benefits and costs of rooftop solar and the debunking of some long-standing myths about solar. To wrap up, what advice would you give either to utility regulators in California or other states if they care about making electricity affordable? What should be their top priorities? Where should they be looking for what is making electricity more costly?
Long term, they need to change the regulatory model. And I've written up some on this, but something more involved than just performance-based rate making. So setting targets for utility spending and having them transparent and enforceable so that they're much harder to game than what the utilities can do. The other thing is to audit utility spending and make sure that it's used and useful, which is a technical legal term that in which the utilities can be held to show that whatever they're investing is actually being used by customers. And it's a good case that there's probably a lot of stranded capital investment out there that we are still paying for, that actually shareholders should be eating the cost of, or figuring out some different way of recovering that cost over time. So taking transmission assets and recovering them over 60 years instead of 40 years if we have too much transmission. Doing things like that in order to still leave shareholders essentially financially whole, but lower rates in the long run.
Well, Richard, thanks again for joining me. I just really appreciate the work that you've done, the evidence-based approach that you brought to the debate in California, and I really hope that it helps unlock some better solutions.
Yep. Well, thank you for the opportunity for speaking with you, and hopefully we make a difference.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Local Energy Rules with regulatory economist Richard McCann, partner at M3 Consulting, about his study showing the net benefits of rooftop solar to California's electricity customers, solar and non-solar alike. On the show page, look for a link to the study and an excellent Canary Media summary article, as well as other research by Richard on what drives utility bill costs in California. We'll share a link to Bill Power's Sunrise PowerLink Transmission Alternatives Analysis, and we'll also have links to my podcast with Sashu Constantine of Vote Solar about California's solar policy mistake, episode 192, my conversation with Claire Weiner about the loophole for utility transmission investments, episode 233, and my recent conversation with Mark Ellis about how to reduce excessive utility profits by targeting their rate of return, episode 226. We'll also post a link to 2 podcasts with Dawn Weiss, CEO of the community choice agency Marin Clean Energy. One, my interview with her from 2014, episode 19, that I mentioned during the interview, and the recent one that she did with David Roberts at Volts. Local Energy Rules is produced by myself and Ingrid Burson, with editing provided by audio engineer Drew Birschbach. Tune back into Local Energy Rules every 2 weeks to hear how we can take on concentrated power to transform the energy system. Until next time, keep your energy local, and thanks for listening.